My boyfriend cut off the long hair I'd been growing for 3 years while I was asleep. I confronted him, demanding to know why he'd done it. His only response: "I did it for your own good." When I woke up, my waist-length locks were gone, replaced by choppy chin-length hair. I pinched myself hard, half expecting to wake up from a nightmare. The pain was real. My hair was really gone. Tears welled up in my eyes instantly. I reached up to touch the prickly ends of my new haircut, and the floodgates opened. Sobs racked my body as I whispered through gritted teeth, "Cole, it had to be Cole. No one else would dare." That hair had been my pride and joy for 3 years. 3 years of no perming, no dyeing, no cutting, just careful washing and conditioning every 3 days to keep it thick, black, and silky. Now it was all gone. I stormed out of the bathroom and into the living room. Cole was at the dining table, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. He wore silver-rimmed glasses and a light gray silk pajama set, sitting ramrod straight in the main chair. In front of him was his usual, a sandwich and a glass of milk. He glanced up at the sound of my footsteps, his voice flat and unconcerned. "Why are you rushing around like that? Your breakfast is in the kitchen, go get it yourself." Tears streamed down my face as I trembled uncontrollably. But he acted like he didn't even see me. I choked back a sob, my voice sharp with rage as I demanded, "Where's my hair? Did you cut it?" "Yes, I did," Cole admitted without hesitation, as if he'd just told me he'd folded the laundry. His nonchalance pushed me over the edge. "Why? Have you lost your mind? Why would you cut my hair? Who do you think you are?" Through blurry eyes, I saw his brows furrow. Cole was annoyed. "You waste too much time on your hair," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "It's pointless. I've told you 100 times to cut it, but you always hesitated, so I made the decision for you." "You made the decision for me?" I screamed. "I never hesitated. I told you straight out I wasn't going to cut it. Who gave you the right to make choices for me?" Cole stood up so suddenly his chair scraped against the floor. He loomed over me, casting me in his shadow. "I have the right because you're my girlfriend." Cole had always had an intimidating presence, a way of making people feel small with just his gaze. I stumbled back in panic, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor. The pain shooting up my spine was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in my chest. He stared down at me, his eyes cold with reproach, not a hint of concern in sight. Something in me snapped. The anger faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. "There is no after this," I said quietly. Cole's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" I pushed myself up using the edge of the counter, my voice steady despite the tears still streaming down my face. "Cole, we're done. We're breaking up." His face darkened instantly. "You can't keep throwing tantrums and threatening to break up every time you're upset. Susie Miller, are you still a child?" I didn't have the energy to argue. All I wanted was to get away from him, far away. He grabbed my arm as I tried to walk past him, his grip tight and desperate. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" "Let go of me," I said, my voice like ice. But he only held on tighter. "This is about the hair?" "Susie, you're being ridiculous." I wrenched my arm free, my patience finally snapping. "Ridiculous? Is that what you're calling it? Do you not see anything wrong with what you did? This is my hair, Cole. I grew it for 3 years. It's mine alone. No one has the right to decide what happens to it but me." I ran to the bedroom, threw a few essential items into a suitcase, and zipped it shut. I'd lived with him for a year. One suitcase was nowhere near enough to carry all my things. "I'll come back for the rest later," I said, avoiding his gaze. Cole hadn't said a word since I started packing. He just stood there, watching me with that cold, unreadable expression of his. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me at the door. "Susie, I don't accept this. You're not thinking straight right now. We'll talk when you've calmed down." I didn't go home to my parents after leaving Cole's place. Instead, I went to Haley Hale's apartment. To my parents, Cole was the perfect son-in-law. Landing someone like him, they always said, was the luckiest thing that had ever happened to me. Anytime we fought, they took his side without hesitation. I couldn't bear to listen to them lecture me right now. To hear them say I was overreacting, it would break me. But Haley was different. She was the only one who'd ever told me I should break up with Cole. She stared at me in shock when she opened the door, her eyes widening as they fell on my hair. "What happened to your hair?" she gasped. My composure crumbled instantly. I burst into tears, collapsing into her arms. "Cole cut it. He cut it while I was asleep." Haley's face turned livid. "That bastard. I'm going to kill him." I clung to her, terrified she'd actually follow through. Haley came from old money. Her father, fearing she'd be kidnapped, had enrolled her in kickboxing lessons since she was a kid. Despite her petite, doll-like appearance, she could take down most men with ease. I didn't want her to get arrested for beating Cole to a pulp. My heart ached as I thought about everything. Cole and I had been together for almost 2 years, already talking about marriage. There was a time when I truly believed he was the best thing that had ever happened to me. But now, this was the final straw. I broke up with him, I said, pulling away from her hug. Really? Haley asked, her eyes lighting up with hope. Really, I confirmed. She led me to the kitchen and heated up a glass of milk for me. The warm liquid soothed my throat, and I suddenly realized how hungry I was. What really happened? She asked, handing me a cookie. Did he hit you? I shook my head. He cut my hair while I was sleeping. Haley looked utterly baffled. He waited until you were sound asleep, then grabbed a pair of scissors and chopped off all your hair. In the middle of the night? Is he insane? Why would he do that? Why indeed? At first, I couldn't understand it either. But as I thought back on our relationship, the signs had been there all along. Cole was a man with severe OCD, or so it seemed to me. He was obsessed with schedules: when to wake up, when to eat, when to go to work, when to come home, when to go to bed. Everything had to be done exactly on time. I was his complete opposite. I loved sleeping in. To me, every extra minute in bed was a small victory. Mornings with him were always a rush as I scrambled to get ready, and I spent more time on my hair than anything else. I loved it. Experimenting with different braids and updos every day, sometimes redoing them half a dozen times until I was satisfied. Cole had told me countless times to cut it, calling it a waste of time, a pointless vanity. But I think there was another reason too. Hair falls out, it's a natural part of life. But Cole was a germaphobe. Anytime he found a stray hair on the bed, the couch, or the floor, his face would twist in disgust. I tried my best to clean up after myself, but it wasn't enough. In the end, he'd taken matters into his own hands, quite literally. Haley let out a frustrated huff after I finished explaining. I told you he was crazy. Who does something like that? Susie, you have to stay strong this time. This is not normal behavior. He got annoyed with your hair, so he cut it off. What's next? If he gets annoyed with you, will he come at you with a knife? Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I thought about the scissors hovering over my scalp while I slept, about how easily they could have slipped and cut my throat instead. The mere thought made my blood run cold. Haley must have seen the terror on my face, because she quickly backtracked. I'm just saying, he's got a serious control issue. But he's not a murderer, probably. Come on, she said, grabbing her purse. I'm taking you to a salon. The mention of hair made my scalp prickle with anxiety. No way, I can't go to a salon right now. Haley tugged at my short hair, rolling her eyes. Do you have a better idea? This haircut looks like it was done with a lawnmower. Come on, new hair, new start. Isn't that what they say? You're definitely getting a new start now, she added with a weak smile. I couldn't say no to her. She dragged me to the most upscale salon in the city. Its sleek, minimalist decor and high-end products made it clear that this place didn't come cheap. I tried to suggest we go somewhere more affordable, but Haley just shook her head. Trust me, she said. Only the best can fix this disaster. Her words made my mood plummet even further. The salon's lead stylist examined my hair carefully before suggesting a textured lob and a light chestnut dye job. When he was done, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. My shaggy, uneven haircut had been transformed into a chic, layered style that framed my face perfectly. Wow, Haley breathed. You went from sweet girl next door to total boss babe. It's perfect. She was right. The new haircut made me feel like a different person, stronger, more confident. My spirits lifted for the first time all day. But that feeling didn't last long. Just like the ice cream that cost twice as much as you expect, this salon was a total price shocker. I'd mentally prepared myself to spend a couple $100, maybe even $1,000 if I was feeling generous. But when the receptionist handed me the bill, my jaw dropped. $12,000? I spluttered. Can I get a refund? Haley reached for her credit card, but I stopped her. I'll pay for it. It's my hair, after all. Don't be ridiculous, she said, swatting my hand away. I've got a membership here, it's discounted. Besides, this place is going out of business soon. I need to use up the money in my card before it's wasted. The receptionist's smile faltered at Haley's words. In the end, Haley won. She always did, using her womanly persuasion, aka her death grip on my wrist, to stop me from paying. She linked arms with me as we left the salon, grinning. Cheer up. You're treating me to dinner as repayment? We didn't just have dinner. We went to a bar afterward, and I ordered a drink for the first time in years. I'd always had a high tolerance, nothing impressive, but I could hold my own against most people. But Cole had forbidden me from drinking shortly after we started dating. Drinking is bad for you, he'd said, his tone firm but seemingly caring. It's dangerous for a girl to be out alone at night, drunk and vulnerable. I worry about you. Can't you do this one thing for me? I'd agreed without hesitation, thinking it was a sweet gesture, a sign of how much he cared. If I'd refused, I would have been the unreasonable one, right? So I'd stopped drinking entirely, proudly telling anyone who asked that my boyfriend didn't want me to drink because he loved me too much to see me hurt. But hindsight is 20/20. Over the years, Cole had used the excuse of love to impose countless rules on me. Anytime I protested or even hesitated to obey, he'd hit me with the same lines. I'm doing this for your own good, it's because I love you. Can't you make a little sacrifice for me? I'd compromised again and again, giving up more and more of myself to make him happy. And how had he repaid me? By cutting off my hair while I slept. Anger bubbled up inside me as I thought about it. I lifted my glass and downed the drink in one gulp. Whoa, slow down, Haley exclaimed, grabbing my wrist. Haley, I said, slamming the empty glass back down on the table. Do you think I made a mistake by being with Cole all these years? My voice was shaky, full of doubt. Haley studied me for a moment before asking, is this really just about the hair? Or is there something more? I flinched, burying my face in my hands. Haley rubbed my back gently. It's okay if you don't want to talk about it. I shook my head. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk, it was that I didn't know how to put it into words. After a long moment, I finally managed to speak, my voice barely a whisper. Cole pushed me off a cliff. That wasn't entirely accurate, but it's how I felt. I'd never been a huge fan of heights, nothing crippling, just a normal fear of glass bridges, roller coasters, and drop towers. It was a minor quirk, something I'd never felt the need to overcome. But Cole had thought otherwise. If you want to be a better person, he'd said, you have to face your fears, I'll help you. His idea of helping was taking me bungee jumping. I'd refused flat out. It was the first time I'd ever said no to him so firmly. He'd seemed to accept it, telling me, fine, don't jump, just come with me. I'll do it for you. To show you it's not that scary. I'd been touched by his gesture, thinking he was doing it all for me. But when we got to the jump site, everything changed. He dragged me over to the staff and told them to strap me into the harness. I'd been so shocked I didn't resist at first. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I'd started crying and begging, and even the staff had tried to intervene. She doesn't want to do this, one of them had said to Cole. We can't force her, Cole had nodded, a fake smile on his face. She doesn't have to jump. We just want to feel what it's like up there. Is she properly secured? The staff had assured him she was. I'd believed him, thinking he really just wanted me to face my fear of heights, not the jump itself. But when I'd stepped onto the platform, he'd shoved me off without a second thought. When did this happen? Haley asked, her voice tight with anger. Why didn't you tell me? 10 months ago, I said, staring at the table. You were abroad for work. The second I'd fallen, I'd been convinced I was going to die, and I almost had my heart had stopped, and I'd gone into shock. I'd been lucky to survive. That psycho, Haley hissed, slamming her fist on the table. And you stayed with him after that? Are you suicidal? I'd been terrified after that, so scared I'd wanted to break up with him immediately, so scared I couldn't even look him in the eye. But everyone around me had talked me out of it. Cole loves you, they'd said. He just went about it the wrong way. And Cole had been relentless in his apologies. He'd stayed by my side every second I was in the hospital, never leaving my room. Eventually, he'd even gotten down on his knees in front of me, tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, Susie, he'd begged. I'll do anything to make it up to you. Just don't leave me. I'd caved. I'd always been a soft person, and his desperation had tugged at my heartstrings. Besides, I'd told myself, it wasn't like he'd cheated on me. Our relationship could still be fixed. Haley let out a frustrated sigh. You should have ended it then and there. You didn't stand your ground 10 months ago. Don't make the same mistake twice. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Ms. Hale. A familiar voice cut through the noise of the bar, sending a chill down my spine. I froze, thinking I was hallucinating. There was no way Cole was here. Cole, what are you doing here? Haley snapped, jumping up and positioning herself between me and him. I looked up, and there he was, dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, his face dark with suppressed anger, completely out of place in the casual bar setting. This is between me and Susie, Cole said, his voice cold and authoritative. "I'd appreciate it if you stayed out of our business." "Between you and Susie? You mean your ex-girlfriend?" Haley retorted. "She broke up with you. It's over." "I didn't agree to it," Cole said, as if that changed anything. "You don't get a vote. This isn't a divorce. You don't need both parties to agree. Susie wants to break up, so it's done." Haley and Cole had never gotten along, and the tension between them was palpable now. If they were both men, they'd probably be throwing punches by now. But I barely noticed. I was too busy staring at Cole, my mind racing. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice shaking. Cole's brows furrowed. "Susie Miller. I told you to go home and calm down, not go out drinking. Have you already forgotten what you promised me?" "I asked you how you found me," I repeated, louder this time. "Come home with me," he said, ignoring my question. "This isn't a place for you." His refusal to answer pushed me over the edge. I grabbed my purse and threw it at him, hitting him square in the chest. "How did you find me, Cole? Were you tracking me?" He stumbled back slightly, finally breaking under my relentless gaze. "I installed a tracker on your phone," he admitted, his voice quiet but unapologetic. A wave of cold fear washed over me, making my blood run cold. "You son of a bitch," Haley started, lunging for him. But I grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Just leave," I said to Cole, my voice tired and defeated. "I don't want to make a scene. Come home with me," he repeated, taking a step toward me. "Don't push me, Cole," I warned, my voice low and threatening. Something in my tone must have gotten through to him, because he stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Susie, don't drink. It's bad for you. I worry about you. Get out of here, you condescending asshole," Haley shouted, picking up a nearby beer bottle and waving it at him. "Before I break this over your head." Cole finally left, but the mood was ruined. We paid our tab and headed back to Haley's apartment, neither of us saying much on the way. I didn't sleep well that night, just like I hadn't for the past 10 months. After the bungee jumping incident, our relationship had been strained beyond repair. I'd forgiven Cole, but I'd never really moved past it. I'd started to see him differently, to notice things I'd overlooked before. All the little rules he'd imposed on me over the years had started to feel suffocating. No adding men on social media, no wearing skirts above the knee, no heavy makeup, no staying out past 8 p.m. I had to shower and change clothes immediately after coming home, or I wasn't allowed to sit on any furniture. No eating snacks inside the house, they left crumbs and smells. We had separate mugs, and woe betide me if I ever used his, when he was working. I had to sit with him in silence. No TV, no phone, no distractions. My phone had to be turned off by 10 p.m., and the lights had to be out immediately after. I even had to eat exactly what he told me to, when he told me to. The list went on and on. I'd never really rebelled against these rules before, always convinced by his words of love and concern. But the bungee jump had shattered that illusion. For the first time, I'd seen our relationship for what it really was. A prison, and Cole was my jailer. No relationship ends suddenly. It's a death by 1,000 cuts, a series of small hurts and betrayals that eventually pile up until the whole thing collapses. Adult breakdowns only happen at night, because during the day, you still have to go to work. When I walked into the office the next morning, everyone stared. I couldn't blame them. I'd stared at my reflection in the mirror for a good 10 minutes that morning, barely recognizing myself. "New haircut?" one of the older ladies from accounting asked, smiling kindly. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Time for a change. It suits you," she said, nodding approvingly. The day passed slowly, and by the end of it, my co-workers were talking about going out for hot pot after work. They never invited me anymore, not because they didn't like me, but because I'd turned them down so many times. Cole had never liked me going out with colleagues, especially not with male ones. "Can I come?" I asked, surprising even myself. They stared at me in shock for a moment before grinning. "Of course," they said, "we'd love to have you." But my excitement was short-lived. As we walked out of the building, I saw a familiar car parked by the curb. Cole's. I ignored it, heading straight for my co-worker's car. But a pair of strong arms grabbed me from behind, yanking me back. I froze, caught between my confused co-workers and the man who was supposed to be my ex-boyfriend. I forced a smile, turning to my colleagues. "I'm so sorry, guys, something came up. I'll have to take a rain check." I could tell my smile looked fake. My face felt like it was splitting in two. Once they'd left, I wrenched my arm free from Cole's grip. "We need to talk, somewhere private," he suggested, going back to his place. But I refused. Instead, I led him to a nearby cat calf, Perfect Haven cat calf. Cole refused to go in, his face twisting in disgust. Are you insane? You know I'm allergic to cat hair. You're not allergic, I said, rolling my eyes. You just don't like cats. Because of your precious cleanliness, and because of that, I had to give thank you to my parents, I added, referring to my beloved cat, whom I'd had to rehome shortly after moving in with Cole. What is this really about, Susie? He asked, his patience wearing thin. It's about compromise, I said, staring him straight in the eye. In our entire relationship, I'm the only one who's ever compromised. I've given up everything for you, my cat, my friends, my freedom. Now it's your turn. Either you come in here with me, or this conversation is over, forever. With that, I turned and walked into the calf, leaving him standing there. To my surprise, he followed me in, his face tight with discomfort, his body rigid as a board. People would see him and think he was so loving, so devoted, willing to overcome his allergies just for me. He probably thought so too. Happy now? He snapped, as soon as we sat down at a table. I'm here. Can we go home now? I ignored his question, instead nodding at a nearby orange cat that was rubbing against my leg. Are you uncomfortable right now? Do you feel like you're covered in germs? Like every inch of you is crawling? His muscles tensed, confirming my suspicions. I stroked the cat gently, meeting his eyes across the table. Now you know how I felt when you pushed me off that 200-meter cliff, I said quietly. He blinked in surprise, his expression quickly turning to annoyance. I already apologized for that, Susie. I admitted I was wrong. I even got on my knees and begged for your forgiveness. What more do you want from me? I don't want anything from you, I said, my voice steady. I just want you to understand that you hurt me. I tried to forgive you, but all you did was double down on your control. I don't want this anymore, Cole. I want us to end this amicably. I'd thought that would be the end of it, that we could finally part ways without any more drama. But he opened his mouth, and any hope I'd had vanished. I did it for your own good, he said, his voice earnest, like he truly believed it. You're too indecisive, too immature. As your boyfriend, it's my responsibility to make the right choices for you. In that moment, I knew there was no point in talking anymore. We were speaking two different languages, living in two different worlds. Cole, we're done, I said, standing up. I don't care if you accept it or not. I'm not coming back to you. I never will. Leave me alone. His voice rose, filled with frustration and anger. Will you stop being so dramatic? It's just hair. Fine, I'm sorry. Happy now? Just hair? I echoed, my eyes filling with tears. It was my hair, Cole. You had no right to cut it. Of course you should be sorry. My throat burned, and I could feel tears streaming down my face. I regret ever getting together with you, I said, my voice breaking. Then you should have never said yes in the first place, Susie Miller. I don't accept this breakup. You don't have the right to leave me. The words were so absurd. I almost laughed. We were in a relationship, Cole, a mutual, consensual relationship. Why don't I have the right to end it? Because I chased you for 6 months, he said, his voice rising. Because I gave you everything. How dare you leave me after everything I've done for you? I was so angry. My whole body was shaking. So now you want to keep score? Fine. Name your price. How much do I owe you for those 6 months? I'll write you a check right now. You can't pay me back for my time, my effort, my love. He spat. That was the final straw. I grabbed my coffee and threw it in his face, the hot liquid splattering all over his suit and his shocked expression. You think I owe you something? We were equals, Cole. I loved you too. I gave you everything I had, but in your eyes, it was all just taking, wasn't it? You're unbelievable. Cole had chased me for 6 months, showering me with attention and affection. We'd met at a business dinner, one of those sleazy affairs where men drank too much and looked at women like pieces of meat. I'd just graduated from college, naive and eager to please, when my boss had told me to come along. I'd thought it was a sign of his trust. Now I know he just wanted to use my looks to seal the deal. The men at the table had swarmed me, plying me with drinks, while my boss had sat back and watched, doing nothing. It was Cole who'd stepped in, his voice cutting through the noise. Leave the girl alone, he'd said, his tone cold and authoritative. If you want to drink, drink with me. Cole came from old money. His father, Julian Voss, was a real estate tycoon, and Cole himself had built a successful company from the ground up. The men at the table had backed off immediately, not wanting to cross him. As we were leaving, he'd pulled me aside, his voice low and urgent. Quit this job, run, before it's too late. I'd taken his advice, quitting the next day. The next time I saw him was at my new job. He'd walked into the office, and when he'd seen me, he'd smiled in surprise. "You listened," he'd said, a hint of amusement in his voice. After that, he'd started showing up everywhere at my favorite cafe, outside my apartment building. Even at the grocery store, he'd ask me out to dinner, to the movies, sending me flowers and gifts almost every day. It was hard not to be charmed by Cole. He was mature, handsome, successful, everything a woman could want, but I'd been scared, convinced I was out of my league. I'd told myself we were too different, that a relationship between us could never work. So when he'd confessed his feelings a month later, I'd turned him down, but he hadn't given up. If anything, my refusal had only made him more determined, like I was a challenge he had to win. For 6 months, he'd done everything he could to make me fall for him, and there were 2 moments that had finally broken down my defenses. The first was when I'd been stuck on a business trip, stranded by a thunderstorm on my birthday. Cole had driven over 1,000 miles just to be with me, showing up at my hotel room in the middle of the night, soaking wet, just to say happy birthday in person. The second was when I'd gotten into a car accident, a minor fender bender, but the other driver had been furious, screaming at me and even threatening to hit me. I'd been terrified, not knowing what to do, when Cole had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, diffusing the situation with a few calm words. When I'd asked him how he'd known where to find me, he'd smiled and said, "I was worried about you driving alone, so I installed an emergency alert system in your car. If there's any impact or accident, I get a notification immediately." "You're not mad, are you?" he'd asked, looking almost nervous. I'd been so blinded by love. I'd thought it was the sweetest gesture in the world. I'd been thrilled by the idea that he cared so much, that he'd gone to such lengths to protect me. But now I realize he never even asked for my permission. He'd just done it, assuming I'd be grateful. The signs had been there all along. I'd just been too in love to see them. Thinking about that emergency alert system, I decided to get it removed from my car. But when I'd taken it to the dealership, the mechanic had looked at me like I was crazy. "We don't install those systems in civilian cars," he'd said. "They're for law enforcement and emergency vehicles only." I'd been confused, insisting that Cole had told me he'd had it installed. "Can you please check again?" I'd begged reluctantly. He'd agreed, running a full diagnostic on my car. When he was done, he'd looked at me with a mix of sympathy and concern. "Ma'am, do you know there are 2 tracking devices in your car?" he'd asked. "What?" I'd whispered, my blood turning to ice. "One is in the rearview mirror, it tracks your location," he'd explained. "The other is in the dashboard. Right there, it's a hidden camera that records everything inside the car." I'd felt sick to my stomach. It wasn't an emergency alert system at all, it was surveillance. How could he have done that to me? What else had he been hiding? "Are you okay, ma'am?" the mechanic had asked, noticing my pale face. "Do you want me to call the police?" I'd nodded automatically before shaking my head, my mind racing. "Can you please remove them?" "Both of them." I told myself that breaking up with him would fix everything, that once we were apart, he'd leave me alone, but I'd been wrong. Cole had no intention of letting me go. I'd stayed at Haley's for a few days, but she'd eventually asked me the question I'd been dreading. "Aren't you going to go home to your parents?" I'd laughed bitterly. "They don't even know we broke up. How is that possible?" she'd asked, confused. "It's very possible," I'd said, my voice trailing off. "Some people just can't handle the truth." I'd barely finished speaking when my phone rang. My mom. I'd hesitated before answering, my heart sinking when I heard her voice. "Come home for dinner, honey," she'd said, her tone warm but forced. "I made your favorite ants climbing a tree." I'd felt a knot form in my stomach. "I can't, Mom. I have to work late." She'd been silent for a moment before sighing. "Please, Susie, come home. We need to talk." Haley had looked at me curiously after I'd hung up. "What was that all about?" she'd asked. "Ever since I started dating Cole, my mom only calls to ask me to bring him home for dinner," I'd explained. "She didn't mention him once just now, which means she knows we broke up." I hadn't told them, so it must have been Cole. He'd gone to my parents, playing the victim, turning them against me. I'd known I couldn't avoid it forever. Reluctantly, I'd agreed to go home, and sure enough, Cole had been there, sitting in my parents' living room like he owned the place, playing chess with my dad while my mom cooked in the kitchen. He'd stood up the second I walked in, a fake smile on his face. "You're home," he'd said, as if we were still a happy couple. I'd stared at him in shock, barely recognizing the man in front of me. His hair was gone, shaved completely bald, leaving his scalp smooth and pale. A month ago, I would have laughed, teasing him about how silly he looked. But now, I just felt a cold sense of dread. Do I look that bad? He'd asked, running a hand over his head, his smile faltering. He'd stepped closer, grabbing my hand, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. Susie, I'm sorry, he'd said, his voice soft and pleading. I was wrong to cut your hair without your permission. I shaved my head to show you how sorry I am. Can you forgive me, please? I'd pulled my hand away, stepping back from him, my expression cold. No, it's not just about the hair, Cole, I'd said, my voice steady. It's about everything. The control, the lies, the way you treat me like I'm some kind of possession. I can't do this anymore. I know you're still upset about the bungee jumping, he'd said, his voice desperate. I'll do it. I'll jump 100 times if that's what it takes to make you forgive me. Just tell me what to do, Susie. I'll do anything. A wave of exhaustion had washed over me, making me feel lightheaded. It's not about one thing, Cole, I'd said, my voice breaking. It's about every single thing. The past 2 years have been a nightmare. I'm suffocating. I can't breathe, please. Just let me go. The fake smile had dropped from his face, replaced by that cold, familiar anger. He'd stared at me, his eyes dark and menacing, and I'd felt a flicker of fear. But before he could say anything, my mom had walked in from the kitchen, clapping her hands together like nothing was wrong. Now, no need for all this drama, she'd said, giving my arm a playful slap, talking about death and breakups at the dinner table. How morbid. You kids are always overreacting. It's just hair, for goodness sake. It'll grow back. Remember when you were little and you glued gum in your hair? We had to shave it off then too, and you survived just fine. This is not the same thing, I'd shouted, my patience finally snapping. My mom had raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp. And why not, exactly? She'd soften when she saw the tears in my eyes, stepping closer and placing a hand on my shoulder. I know you're upset, honey, but Cole has apologized. He even shaved his head for you. Can't you just forgive him? Let's just drop it, okay? No need to make a mountain out of a molehill. Looking at my mom's dismissive expression, my dad's unconcerned face, and Cole's cold, unrepentant stare, I'd felt like I was going crazy, like I was the only one who saw how messed up this situation was. Do you even know what he did? I'd asked, my voice shaking. He installed hidden cameras in my car. He's been spying on me. That's illegal, Mom. He violated my privacy, my trust, everything. My words had fallen on deaf ears, disappearing into the air like dust. I'd stumbled back, staring at them in disbelief. You knew, I'd whispered. You all knew and you didn't say anything. My mom had sighed, looking at me with that same tired, disappointed expression she'd had my entire life. He did it because he cares about you, Susie, she'd said. Like that made it okay. You're a terrible driver. You're always getting into fender benders, scraping against curbs. Can you blame him for worrying? He should have asked me, I'd shouted. He had no right to do that without my permission. He was afraid you'd say no, my mom had retorted. Then he shouldn't have done it at all, I'd screamed. It was a circular argument, one we'd had 100 times before. I'd felt like I was going in circles, my voice getting louder and more desperate with each word. I don't want his care. I don't want his protection. Why are you being so ungrateful? My dad had snapped, slamming his fist on the table. Can't you see how good he is to you? I'd turned on Cole then, my anger boiling over. This is all your fault. You told them, didn't you? You made them think I'm the crazy one, the ungrateful one. You're loving every second of this, aren't you? Seeing everyone take your side, watching me suffer? I'm telling you right now, Cole, I'd said, my voice cold and deadly. Nothing you say or do will change my mind. This is over, for good, Susie Miller. My dad had roared, standing up so quickly his chair fell over. Have we spoiled you so much that you think you can treat people like this? Show some respect. Calm down, my mom had said, pulling my dad back into his seat. You stay here with Cole, I'll talk to her. She dragged me into my childhood bedroom, closing the door behind her. Susie, be reasonable, she'd said, sitting down on my bed and patting the spot next to her. I know you're hurt, but this is getting ridiculous. If you keep this up, you're going to ruin everything. I'd stared at her, my heart breaking. Do you really think I'm overreacting? That I'm just being dramatic? She'd been silent, which was answer enough. I'd let out a bitter laugh, feeling more alone than ever. I'm not being dramatic, Mom, I'm serious. I want to break up with him, for real this time. Why? She'd asked, Like she truly didn't understand, because he cut your hair? Is that really worth throwing away 2 years of your life? It's not just the hair, Mom, I'd said, my voice breaking. He makes me write self-criticisms when I misbehave. I'd explained to her how Cole had a list of rules a mile long, and if I broke any of them even accidentally, I had to write a detailed apology, admitting my mistake and promising never to do it again. At first, I'd thought it was cute, a quirky way for him to express his feelings. I'd even written them like love letters, pouring my heart out on the page. But as time went on, the rules had gotten more and more ridiculous, the self-criticisms more and more frequent. I'd eventually refused to write them, leading to a 15-day Cold War that I caved on. Unable to handle his silent treatment. Do you know how cold he is to me, Mom? I'd asked, tears streaming down my face. When I fall, he doesn't help me up, he yells at me for being clumsy. When I cut my hand, he doesn't get me a bandage, he scolds me for being careless. Last month, I twisted my ankle while we were hiking, and I begged him to help me, but he refused. He said I had to take responsibility for my actions and walk down the mountain on my own. By the time I got to the bottom, my ankle was so swollen I could barely stand. I cried and cried, asking him why he'd been so cruel, and you know what he said? He said he did it because he loves me, that real love isn't about coddling, it's about making me a better person. My mom had sighed, patting my hand gently. Boys will be boys, honey, your father is the same way. I dropped a plate yesterday, and he lectured me for half an hour about being more careful. It's just how men are. But Dad helps you clean up the mess, Mom. I'd shouted. He doesn't just stand there and watch you struggle. He doesn't make you feel like garbage for making a mistake. I'd only just started to realize the truth of our relationship, the coldness, the lack of empathy, the way he looked at me like I was a project to be fixed, not a person to be loved. Mom, remember when you asked me why Shane and I stopped talking? I'd said, referring to my childhood best friend, whom I'd lost touch with shortly after meeting Cole. I told you it was because we'd grown apart. But that's not true. Cole made me stop talking to him. He didn't like me being friends with boys now. The only man in my phone besides Dad is Cole. I have no other friends, no other life. My mom had been silent for a long time, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost sad. Susie, you're still young, she'd said. You don't understand how the world works. No one is perfect, honey. Cole is as close as it gets. He doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke. He doesn't cheat. He cooks for you, cleans for you, takes care of you. And he's loaded. You'll never have to worry about money again. Men like that are a dime a dozen these days. You'd be a fool to let him go. He's made mistakes, I know, she'd continued. But he does it all because he loves you. He just has a funny way of showing it. And let's be honest, you've always forgiven him before, haven't you? You always come around, Susie. People aren't perfect, she'd said, squeezing my hand. You can't expect them to be. Sometimes, you have to take the good with the bad. We'd argued for hours, neither of us willing to back down. I'd left the house feeling more alone than ever, my heart breaking a little more with each step. Cole had followed me out, catching up to me at the bottom of the driveway. What do you want, Cole? I'd asked, my voice tired and defeated. I want us to go back to the way things were, he'd said, his voice soft, almost pleading. The way things were? I'd repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You mean the way things were when you controlled every aspect of my life? When I had to ask for permission to breathe? When I was nothing more than a doll for you to dress up and play with? I don't want that back, Cole. I never did. His patience had finally snapped, his face twisting in anger. I was trying to help you. I was trying to make you a better person. You used to be so obedient, so grateful. What happened to you? Did Haley put these ideas in your head? Is she poisoning you against me? This has nothing to do with Haley, I'd said, my voice cold. This is about us, about you. Can't you see that you're the problem here? What's wrong with wanting you to be the best version of yourself? He'd shouted, if you're not willing to change for me, then what's the point of this relationship? Maybe the problem is that you're the one who needs to change. I'd retorted. Why is it always me who has to compromise? Why can't you ever meet me halfway? He'd stared at me, his eyes filled with disbelief. Susie Miller, I've given up everything for you. What more do you want from me? I want you to leave me alone, I'd said, my voice breaking. I want to break up. I want my life back. But he'd just shaken his head, a determined look on his face. I'll give you anything but that, Susie. You're not leaving me. Not now, not ever. Cole had refused to give up. He'd started showing up everywhere I went, like a shadow I couldn't shake. He'd wait for me outside Haley's apartment every morning, offering to drive me to work, I'd ignore him, driving to work alone, but he'd follow me anyway. His car always a few feet behind mine, until I'd safely reach the office. He'd send me lunch every day, expensive, fancy meals from my favorite restaurants, but I'd throw them away, unable to stomach the thought of eating anything he'd touched. He'd send me flowers every night, 9 red roses, his signature gesture, but I'd leave them at the door, letting them wilt and die. He'd even wait for me outside the office every night, following me home like a lost puppy. I'd originally planned to move out of Haley's apartment as soon as possible, but after a week of Cole's relentless stalking, she'd insisted I stay. We should call the police, she'd said one night, her voice filled with concern. He's acting like a total creep. And have you seen the way he looks at you lately? He's not right in the head, Susie. He's dangerous. I'd been silent, staring out the window at the dark street below. I'd known she was right, but I'd been too scared to take that step. I didn't want to make things worse. I didn't want our breakup to be ugly, so I decided to talk to him one last time, to try to reason with him. I'd waited until he'd followed me home from work, walking up to his car and tapping on the window. He'd rolled it down, his face lighting up when he saw me, like he thought I'd finally come to my senses. Cole, this has to stop, I'd said, my voice steady. If you keep following me, if you keep harassing me, I'll call the police. I'll get a restraining order. I'm not joking. I couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, but I could hear the sadness in his voice. So that's it? No matter what I do, you're never coming back to me. I'd hesitated for a moment before speaking, my voice softening. Cole, our relationship ended 10 months ago. When you pushed me off that cliff, the past 10 months have been nothing but a lie, a desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already dead. I tried, Cole, I really did, but I can't do this anymore. I can't be with someone who doesn't respect me, who doesn't love me for who I am. I don't want to hear this, he'd said, cutting me off, his voice filled with anger and pain. You'll never find anyone who loves you as much as I do, Susie Miller. Never. I'd laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the quiet street. I've been asking myself the same question for months. Was this really love? Was any of this worth it? Cole, he'd started to say, his voice trailing off. What? I'd asked, leaning in, unable to hear him. Nothing, he'd said, shaking his head. When do you want to come get your things? I felt a wave of relief wash over me, thinking he'd finally given up. Just tell me when you're going to be out of the house, and I'll come by. I'll leave the key on the mat. He'd been silent for a moment before answering. I have a business trip the day after tomorrow. I'll be gone all day. Perfect, I'd said, turning to leave. I'll be there then. I'd taken the day off work to go to Cole's apartment, hiring a moving company to help me transport my things. Haley had wanted to come with me, but her father had forced her to go on a blind date, leaving me with a stern warning. Call me the second something feels off, she'd said, pointing a finger at me. I don't care if I'm in the middle of dinner, I'll drop everything and come get you. And if he so much as looks at you the wrong way, I'll break every bone in his body. I'd rolled my eyes, but I'd appreciated the concern. Relax, Haley, I'm just picking up my things. It's not like I'm walking into a war zone, she'd snorted, crossing her arms over her chest. With Cole, it might as well be. That guy's got bad news written all over him. I have a bad feeling about this. I'd thought she was being paranoid, but as I stood in Cole's immaculate apartment, staring at the door that had just slammed shut behind me, I realized she'd been right all along. I'd arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, the moving company waiting downstairs. I'd planned to be in and out in an hour tops. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, spotless, organized to the point of being sterile. Every object in its place. Even the mugs on the counter were lined up in a perfect straight line. It had never bothered me before, but now it felt cold, lifeless, like a museum exhibit rather than a home. I'd taken a deep breath, pushing the thought aside, and started packing my things. I didn't have much out in the open. Cole had never liked my clutter, but the storage closet was filled with boxes of my things. Things I'd bought to make the apartment feel more like home. Things he'd insisted we didn't need right now. I'd been just about to finish packing my shoes when the front door had suddenly opened, making me jump. I'd turned around, my heart stopping when I saw Cole standing there. His face pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and sunken. He'd lost weight, his cheekbones protruding sharply, making him look almost unrecognizable. Gone was the confident, composed man I'd known. This was someone else entirely, someone cold and dangerous. What are you doing here? I'd asked, my voice shaking. I thought you were on a business trip. He'd shrugged, kicking off his shoes and walking past me into the apartment, like he owned the place. I forgot some important documents. I had to come back. Oh, I'd said, my mind racing. I'm just packing my things. I'll be out of your hair soon, he'd grunted in response, disappearing into his home office. I'd let out a sigh of relief, my shoulders slumping. Maybe this would be okay after all. I'd just finished packing my shoes when he'd emerged from the office. Walking over to me and stopping in front of me. Can I borrow your phone? He'd asked, his voice casual. I can't find mine. I'd handed it to him without thinking, watching as he walked back into the office. Something about the situation felt off. Cole was the most organized person I'd ever known. He never lost anything, especially not his phone. But before I could dwell on it, he'd walked back out, handing me my phone. Found it? I'd asked, tucking it into my pocket. He'd ignored the question, walking over to the front door and locking it, turning the deadbolt with a loud click. A sense of dread had washed over me, making my blood run cold. What are you doing, Cole? I'd asked, my voice trembling. I'd turned to grab my keys, only to find them missing from the counter where I'd left them. I'd panicked, searching the apartment frantically, but they were nowhere to be found. Looking for these? He'd asked, holding up my keys, the little cat keychain I loved so much dangling from them. Give them back to me, I'd said, holding out my hand. He'd pulled them back, a cold smile on his face. These are my keys. You can have them back when you're my girlfriend again, when you've learned your lesson. I'd run to the door, yanking on the handle, but it was locked tight. Cole, let me out of here, I'd shouted, kicking the door with all my strength. This is illegal. You're kidnapping me. You'll go to jail for this. Calm down, Susie, he'd said, sitting down on the couch like nothing was wrong. You need to think about what you've done. You need to realize how much you've hurt me. Calm down? I'd repeated, incredulous. You locked me in your apartment. How do you expect me to calm down? I'd grabbed the small stool by the door, lifting it above my head, ready to smash it against the door, when he'd suddenly appeared behind me, wrapping his arms around me and pulling me back. I'd screamed, dropping the stool, but he'd clamped a hand over my mouth, silencing me. I'd struggled against him, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong, his arms like iron bands around my waist. Be quiet, Susie, he'd whispered in my ear, his breath hot against my neck, or I'll have to punish you. And you don't want that, do you? My voice had caught in my throat, my body going limp with fear. I'd stopped struggling, trembling in his arms. He'd smiled against my neck, satisfied. Good girl, he'd said, releasing his grip on my mouth but keeping his arms around me. Now it's just us. No distractions, no Haley, just you and me. You can finally think clearly. I love you, Susie, he'd said, his voice soft and pleading. I've given you everything. I've done everything for you. How could you do this to me? How could you leave me? I'd force myself to calm down, to think of a way out. I'd turn to face him, putting on a fake smile. I'm sorry, Cole. I didn't mean it. I was just upset. I didn't really want to break up. It was a mistake. Can you forgive me? His eyes had lit up with hope, and for a moment, I'd thought I'd fooled him. But the hope had quickly faded, replaced by anger and betrayal. He'd stared at me, his eyes cold and hard. You're lying, he'd said, his voice low and dangerous. You're a bad girl, Susie. You're lying to me. You've been so bad lately, so disobedient. You're getting worse and worse without me, he'd said, shaking his head in disappointment. You're drinking. You're staying out late. You're lying. You need me, Susie. You need me to keep you in line. You're not leaving this apartment until you've learned your lesson, he'd said, sitting down on the couch and patting the spot next to him. Until you've realized how much you need me. I'd sat down next to him, my mind racing. I'd never thought this would happen to me. This was the kind of thing that happened in movies, in horror stories, not to normal people like me. I'd always thought Cole was a good person. Deep down, I'd thought we could part ways amicably, that we could wish each other well and move on with our lives. But I'd been wrong. I'd never really known him at all. What do you want me to say, Cole? I'd asked, my voice trembling. What do you want me to realize? You need to realize that you don't have the right to leave me, he'd said, his voice firm, like he was stating a fact. You need to realize that you're mine. You've always been mine. Why? I'd whispered, the word barely audible. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like this. But this time, there was no anger, no desperation, just cold, hard conviction. He truly believed that I belonged to him. Because I chased you for 6 months, he'd said, his voice rising. Because I gave you everything. You owe me, Susie. You owe me your life. I'd taken a deep breath, trying to reason with him, trying to make him see sense. You did chase me for 6 months, Cole, and I'm grateful for that. But I loved you too. I gave you everything I had. I loved you with all my heart. Don't you think 2 years of my life is enough to pay back 6 months of yours? He'd laughed, a bitter, cruel sound. 2 years? What did you do in those 2 years, Susie? You did nothing but take. You took my money, my time, my love. You gave me nothing in return, so in your eyes, I've given you nothing, I'd said, my voice breaking. He'd looked at me like I was stupid, like the answer was obvious. Of course you haven't. You've never done anything for me. You've always been the one taking. Taking. In that moment, I'd finally realized the truth. Cole had never loved me. Not really. He'd loved the idea of me, the obedient, grateful, perfect girlfriend who would do anything he asked. He'd loved having someone to control, someone to mold into his perfect little doll, but he'd never loved me. What do you want from me, Cole? I'd asked, my voice tired and defeated. I want you to come back to me, he'd said, his voice softening, like he was trying to coax a wild animal into trusting him. I want you to be my girlfriend again. I want things to go back to the way they were. I want my perfect little Susie back. I'd known in that moment that there was no reasoning with him, that Cole had always been this way, controlling, manipulative, cruel. He was just very good at hiding it, very good at making me think his abuse was love. For 2 years, he'd gotten everything he wanted from me. I couldn't think of a single time he'd ever compromised, a single time he'd ever put my needs before his own. I'd started to panic, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. My only hope was that the moving company would notice I was taking too long and come up to check on me. But Cole must have read the hope in my eyes, because he'd smiled, a cold, cruel smile. Don't bother waiting for them, he'd said. I told them to leave. I said we were having a lover's quarrel, that we didn't need their help anymore. They bought it. I'd stared at him in shock, my heart sinking. My last hope was gone. But then I'd thought of Haley. She'd know something was wrong if I didn't call her. She'd come looking for me. Don't count on Haley either, he'd said, as if reading my mind. I called your mother. I told her that Haley was poisoning your mind, that she was the reason we were having problems. I told her to call Haley and tell her to stay out of our business. She did. Haley's a bad influence, he'd said, his voice filled with hatred. She's the reason you're acting like this. If it weren't for her, you'd never have thought of leaving me. You'd still be my perfect little girlfriend. He'd stood up, walking over to me and placing a hand on my cheek, his touch making me recoil in disgust. I told your parents we're going on a trip to fix our relationship, he'd said, his voice soft and menacing. I even called your boss and told her you're taking a personal leave of absence. We have all the time in the world, Susie. All the time in the world for you to realize your mistake. You need to be a good girl, Susie, he'd said, his thumb brushing my cheek. I'm doing this for your own good. I love you. No one else will ever love you as much as I do. I tried to hold back, tried not to anger him further, but I couldn't take it anymore. I'd pushed him away, jumping up from the couch, my voice filled with rage. Don't touch me. His face had darkened instantly, his eyes turning black with anger. Susie, come here, he'd said, his voice low and dangerous. He'd blocked the only exit, leaving me trapped. I'd panicked, my mind racing, searching for a way out. And then I'd remembered the storage closet. I'd turned and ran, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it just as he reached it. Susie, what are you doing? He'd shouted, pounding on the door. Open this door right now. Do you want to starve to death in there? Susie, open the door. I'd ignored him, frantically searching the shelves for what I'd been looking for. I'd heard him sigh, his footsteps retreating. Fine, he'd called through the door. Stay in there, I'm going to make dinner. I'm making your favorite minced pork tofu. Maybe by the time I'm done, you'll have come to your senses. I'd let out a sigh of relief, continuing my search, and then I'd found it, a brand new phone, still in its box, hidden behind a stack of old books. It was a couple's phone, a matching set I'd bought for Cole's birthday last year. He'd seemed so happy when I'd given it to him, promising to use it as soon as his old phone broke, but he'd never touched it, leaving it to collect dust in the back of the closet. I'd thought he'd loved it. But now I realized he'd probably hated it, another reminder that I wasn't the perfect girlfriend he'd wanted. I'd torn open the box, turning the phone on. The startup sound had made me jump, and I'd quickly covered it with my hand, looking nervously at the door when I'd heard nothing. I let out a sigh of relief. The phone had half a charge left, but no SIM card. But it didn't matter, I could still call emergency services. I dialed the number, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice had said, calm and reassuring. Help me, I'd whispered, my voice trembling. I'm being held against my will. My ex-boyfriend locked me in his apartment. The address is 1501, Unit 2, Building 4, Maplewood Estates. Bang! The sound of Cole kicking the door had made me scream, dropping the phone. Susie Miller. You dare call the police? He'd shouted, his voice filled with rage. I'd grabbed the phone, pressing it to my ear, my heart pounding. How had he known? And then I'd seen it, a tiny camera hidden in the corner of the closet, its red light blinking steadily. He had cameras everywhere. The entire apartment was a prison, and I was his prisoner. Ma'am, are you still there? The operator had asked, her voice filled with concern. Please stay calm. Help is on the way. Can you tell me what's happening? The sound of Cole pounding on the door had gotten louder, more violent, like he was trying to break it down. He knows I called you. I'd screamed into the phone. He's trying to break in. Please hurry. Please. Use whatever you can to block the door. Ma'am, the operator had said, her voice steady. Furniture, boxes, anything heavy. Buy yourself some time. The police are on their way. I don't have any furniture. I'd shouted, looking around the small closet. Just shelves and boxes. Use the shelves. Ma'am, she'd said. Push them in front of the door. It should buy you a few minutes, okay? I'd said, my voice trembling. The sound of Cole hitting the door with something heavy had made me jump. Bang, 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 the wood creaking and splintering under the force. I'd grabbed the nearest shelf, pushing it in front of the door just as Cole smashed through it, creating a hole big enough for him to stick his hand through. I'd seen his eyes through the hole, dark, filled with rage, like he wanted to kill me. It hadn't been enough. He'd quickly moved the shelf aside, kicking the door open and stepping into the closet, his face twisted in anger. I'd tried to run, but he'd grabbed me by the hair, yanking me back and slamming me to the ground. I'd cried out in pain, curling up into a ball, but he'd grabbed me by the hair again, pulling me up and slamming my head against the wall. Stars had exploded in my vision, pain shooting through my skull. I'd collapsed to the ground, dazed and disoriented, but I'd still seen the look in his eyes, cold, empty, devoid of any emotion. He looked at me like I was nothing more than a bug he was about to step on. He'd grabbed me by the arm and dragged me into the living room like I was a sack of potatoes. I'd lain on the floor, too weak to move, as he'd straddled me, wrapping his hands around my neck and squeezing. Air had vanished from my lungs, my vision turning black around the edges. I'd struggled, scratching and kicking, but he'd been too strong, his hands like iron bands around my throat. I'd felt my strength fading, my mind growing fuzzy. I'd thought I was going to die. Bang. The sound of the door being kicked open had made Cole freeze. Susie? A familiar voice had shouted. Haley. The pressure around my neck had vanished instantly, fresh air flooding my lungs. I'd gasped for breath, coughing and sputtering. As someone had lifted me into their arms, I'd looked up, seeing Haley's face filled with fear and relief. Before everything had gone black, I woke up in the hospital the next afternoon. The first thing I saw was my mom's tear-streaked face and my dad's worried expression. My mom burst into tears the second she noticed my eyes fluttering open, throwing herself onto the bed and clinging to my hand. Susie, honey, Mommy was wrong. My mom sobbed, her face streaked with tears. I never should have let you be with him. This is all my fault, all of it. How could I blame them? I was the one who'd chosen him, who'd brought him into their lives, who'd gushed about how perfect he was at every chance. They'd only loved him because they loved me, and before Cole had truly hurt me, I'd never imagined he was capable of something like this. I tried to speak, to reassure her, but my throat burned like fire, every word a searing pain. Don't talk, don't you dare, Dad said quickly, gently pressing a hand to my shoulder. He turned to Mom, his voice firm but soft. Enough of this. You're crying so much you'll wear her out. Mom hastily wiped her tears, nodding frantically. Okay, I'll stop. I promise I'll stop. Susie, you're awake. The voice was Haley's. I'd recognized it before I'd lost consciousness. She must have seen the confusion in my eyes, because she hurried to explain. When your mom called me, I knew something was off. You told me how irrational they get when it comes to you and Cole. My mom had suddenly called Haley, claiming we'd made up and begging her to stay out of our private matters. But Haley had never believed it, not for a second. She tried to call me immediately, only to find my phone turned off. That's when she'd known something was terribly wrong, and she'd raced over here as fast as she could. I ran into the police in the neighborhood, she said, her voice tight with relief. That's how I found out what happened to you. You have no idea how close it was. If we'd been even a minute later." She trailed off, and I saw Mom's eyes well up again. I quickly shot her a look. And Haley bit back the rest of her sentence, squeezing my hand instead. As for Cole, there was no escaping jail time. Kidnapping, assault, resisting arrest, and attacking a police officer. His list of charges was long and serious. "Don't you worry about a thing," Haley said, her jaw set with determination. "I'll handle this. I'll make sure he pays for what he did." I didn't care to know the details of his punishment. I stayed in the hospital for 3 days before going home with my parents. But what I hadn't expected was a visit from Cole's father. In 2 years of dating, I'd only met Julian Voss once. He was a man who exuded quiet elegance, with a perpetual smile on his face that made him seem kind and approachable. But his relationship with Cole was toxic, so bad that Cole refused to even call him dad. His purpose in coming was clear. He wanted me to sign a letter of leniency to help reduce Cole's sentence. "I know he's made a terrible mistake," Julian said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "He hurt you, and there's no excuse for that. But at the end of the day, it was all because he loved you. You're the only girlfriend he's ever had. You know that?" I let out a bitter laugh. "He didn't love me. He just wanted a pet, something he could control, something he could tame." Julian looked older than I remembered, his shoulders hunched with the weight of his son's actions. "Name your price. Anything you want, money, favors, anything. Just sign the letter." My parents were furious, stepping forward to shield me. "We want nothing from you. All we want is for the man who hurt our daughter to get what he deserves." But I held up a hand to stop them. "I'll do it, Susie," Mom and Dad exclaimed in unison. I gave them a reassuring look before turning back to Julian. "I'll sign the letter, but I have one condition. No matter how long Cole's sentence is, when he gets out, I never want to see him again, not in this lifetime. No matter how severe his punishment, it would never be life in prison. He'd be free one day." And I'll admit I was scared of what he might do, scared of having to face him again. All I wanted was to never lay eyes on him again. Julian nodded immediately. "You have my word. The second he's released, I'll send him abroad. He'll never set foot in this country again." I watched his retreating figure for a moment before calling out, "If you can, maybe get him some help, a therapist. He needs it." Julian paused, his back stiffening. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." Cole's trial was over quickly, and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Haley shook her head, muttering under her breath, "It's not enough. He got off way too easy." "You're too kind, Susie. If it were me, I'd have made sure he rotted in there." I sighed, exhausted. "A year, 2 years, what does it matter? All I care about is that he leaves me alone. He dare not." Haley snapped, her eyes flashing, but her resolve faltered almost immediately, and she slouched back in her chair. "Though knowing that idiot, he probably will. Word is he's been screaming your name nonstop in there, begging to see you. Why do you always attract the crazies, huh?" I let out a weary sigh. "Tell me about it. What are you going to do now?" Haley asked, changing the subject. I'd quit my job in the aftermath of everything. Too many memories, too many people asking questions. "I think I'll take some time off," I said. "Travel a little, clear my head, then I'll figure out the rest." I smiled at her. "You sure you don't want to come with me? It'll be fun, just us girls, exploring the world." Haley shook her head so hard she looked like a rattle. "No way. I've got a husband to chase." She checked her phone, eyes widening. "Oh crap, I'm late. I have to go pick up my husband from work." With that, she sprinted out the door, leaving me laughing in her wake. Her husband, of course, was the police officer who'd saved me that night. Rumor had it she'd been instantly smitten the moment she saw him take Cole down. All sharp reflexes and unwavering determination. Since then, she'd been relentless in her pursuit, even though he'd never actually agreed to be her boyfriend. But Haley didn't care. She marched through life with the unshakable belief that if you're not my husband now, you will be eventually. Bold, brave, and utterly unapologetic. It was inspiring. She'd found someone to love, someone to fight for, and I was ready to start over, to build a life for myself. One free from control, free from fear. Everything would be okay. I knew it would.
Epilogue. My name is Cole Voss, and I am a sinner. I killed my mother and my baby sister. I was 12 when Mom told us she was pregnant. I was ecstatic, counting down the days until I could hold my little sister, until I could be the big brother I'd always wanted to be. But because of me, she never got the chance to be born. It happened the night I'd rushed out after dinner to play basketball. Mom had called after me, begging me to be careful, to not stay out too late. I'd brushed her off, yelling "I know" over my shoulder before slamming the door. I should have listened to her. I should have stayed home. On my way to the court, a woman stopped me. She was pregnant, her belly round and full, but it didn't diminish her beauty, not one bit. She was stunning, with a voice like honey. "Excuse me," she'd said, smiling sweetly. "Do you know how to get to Villa 3, Block B of Oakridge Manor?" Villa 3, Block B of Oakridge Manor. My home? I didn't think twice, just told her the directions and ran off, eager to meet my friends. 2 hours later, the housekeeper called. She was screaming, hysterical. Mom was bleeding. She said, Mom was in the hospital. Everything after that happened in a blur. Mom had gone into premature labor, hemorrhaging badly. By the time the doctors got to her, it was too late. Mother and child both lost their lives. Grandpa and uncle had flown into a rage, attacking Dad. I'd thrown myself between them, screaming at them to stop. I'd already lost Mom and my sister. Dad was all I'd left, but Uncle had just shoved me aside, his eyes red with fury. "Don't you get it?" he'd roared. "He's the one who killed her. Your father." That's when I learned the truth. Dad had been cheating on Mom. The beautiful woman with the honey voice, the one I directed to our house, was his mistress. She'd shown up that night, big with child, demanding that Mom step aside, that Mom give her husband up. I watched the security footage over and over again, watched as that woman pushed Mom to the ground, watched as blood pooled around her, dark and sticky, watched as Mom crawled, inch by inch, toward the phone in the living room, her strength fading with every move, until she collapsed, unconscious. A trail of blood marked her path. The woman had panicked and run. It wasn't until the housekeeper came home from grocery shopping that Mom was found. It was all Julian's fault. But I was the one who'd led that woman to our door. We were both guilty, unforgivably guilty, and that woman. She'd gone into labor too, not long after. She and her baby had died too. Good deeds reap good rewards, and evil deeds reap evil ones. Karma is a cruel mistress. I hated women after that. Beautiful women, most of all. Their bright eyes hid nothing but lies and manipulation. They were snakes, waiting to strike, waiting to devour anyone who got too close. Until I saw her, the sweet, obedient little girl at that business dinner, sitting at a table full of leering men, like a rabbit caught in a den of wolves, so innocent, so helpless. She'd even turned to the man who'd dragged her there, her boss, for help, not realizing he was the one who'd put her in danger. So stupid, stupidly cute. I'd leaned in and told her to quit her job, to run before it was too late, and to my surprise, she'd listened. She'd actually listened. Good girl. I loved obedient little rabbits. From that day on, I followed her, watched her go to work, watched her eat lunch alone, watched her window shop on weekends. Her life was so simple, so pure, no bad habits, no wild nights out. She kept her distance from men, which was perfect. But she talked to them, smiled at them. That was not perfect, but it was fixable. I'd teach her better. She was so easy to fool. She thought I'd driven 1,000 miles to surprise her on her birthday, not knowing I'd been following her the entire trip. She believed me when I said I'd installed an emergency alert system in her car, never suspecting I'd just been tailing her everywhere she went. I was pleased. She didn't resist my intrusion. She welcomed it, thinking it was love. Eventually, I had her, my perfect little rabbit. And then came the real work, training her. I wanted her to be strong, brave, smart, sensible. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that she obeyed. But she kept forgetting, kept making mistakes. Eventually, she even started resisting me. I'd needed to teach her a lesson. She was afraid of heights, so I took her bungee jumping. I'd planned to push her, to make her face her fear. But she'd almost died. Her heart had stopped, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost my rabbit forever. I'd been terrified. I'd begged her to stay, to forgive me. I'd even gotten on my knees for her, and when she'd finally agreed to stay, I'd been relieved. But she was still disobedient, still stubborn. I'd needed to punish her again, something smaller this time, something that would leave a mark without risking her life. She loved her hair, so I cut it off while she slept, so she couldn't resist. But the rabbit had snapped. She'd screamed, she'd cried, she'd broken up with me. I tried everything to calm her down, everything that had worked before. But nothing had. The way she looked at me, it was all wrong. No adoration, no love, just fear and anger. My rabbit wasn't supposed to look at me like that. I'd had to tame her, properly this time, lock her up, make her see reason. But she'd fought back, bitten the hand that fed her. It hurt, more than I'd expected. But it didn't matter. I'd get out of here, and when I did, I'd find her. I'd fix her. I waited a year, prayed for a year, and finally, the day came. I was free. I could see my rabbit again. But Julian had other plans. He wanted to send me abroad. How dare he? Still want to find her, he'd said, his voice cold. She's getting married, you know, to someone else. I couldn't believe it. My rabbit was going to belong to another man. Impossible. She was mine, only mine. I'm taking you to get help, Julian had said. Help. I didn't need help. I was fine. I just needed my rabbit back. Let go of me, Julian, I'd snarled. You have no right to tell me what to do. You are the last person in this world who has that right. We are blood, he'd retorted. That gives me every right. And you. You have no right to her. She's not yours. She is. I'd screamed. He'd sighed, a sound of utter defeat. I'm taking you overseas. If you get better, we'll come back. If not, we'll die there, together. Something in me snapped. Calm washed over me, cold and final. Die with you. I'd rather die right now. Before Julian could react, I'd thrown open the car door and stepped into the path of an oncoming truck.